fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We have been very fortunate to have him speak to the New England Council Board and at Politics and Eggs several times over the years. So we are truly honored that he could take time to join us again today. I'm sure we're all eager to hear his thoughts about the upcoming midterm elections, not to mention the 2020 presidential. So please join me in giving a very warm Politics and Eggs welcome to our guest speaker this morning, Charlie Cook.
You know, by the time the bullshit got ankle deep, I knew the introduction was almost over, but yeah. Thank you very much, and that was very nice. And Mr. President, thank you, Steve and Neil, and my old buddy Larry Zabar. Larry knew me the last. First of all, I want you to look. I now weigh 100 pounds less than I did 14 months ago, and. The last time I averaged 165 pounds was back when I got to know Larry back in 1980. So I just tell people, okay, it was first half of President Reagan's first term, but is how I clock it. But thank you very much for having me back up here. I've always thought that, you know, when you get your birth certificate, they like staple a bachelor's degree in political science, and then when you turn 25, they staple a PhD when you're living here in New Hampshire. This is an amazing, amazing, amazing place. But thank you and congratulations to St. Anselm's. My favorite poll, you know, I've been doing this since 1984. You know, I haven't been around politics nearly as long as Tom Rath, who was here, you know, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But since I started the newsletter, I'd been involved in politics like a dozen years before that, but when I started the newsletter in 1984, so I've watched like 9 presidentials, 9 midterm elections, and I'll tell you, going into election night 2016, I thought I'd seen everything. I really did. And I tell people, you know, before election night 2016, I was 6'7". Anyway, so you're looking at a considerably more humble person than last time. My favorite poll from last year was one that Marist University did for National Public Radio that found that 58% of Americans were not looking forward to Thanksgiving. They were apprehensive about the political arguments that were going to break out. And you know, it's like, yeah, I can believe that. I can absolutely believe that. And the old Chinese curse about may you live in interesting times, wow. And I do think that we are now at a point where American politics is more bitterly divided than it's been at any time since Reconstruction. And you know, some people want to blame President Trump. Frankly, I think this is a trend that's been going for 30 or 40 years, but we're certainly at a weird time in American politics. But we could talk about this stuff after the midterm election. Every election I can remember, I've heard some moron say, this is the most important election since Moby Dick was a guppy, you know? And you know, hey, every 2 years the entire house is up. So, you know, yeah. But think of it this way. First, how often do you see the U.S. House of Representatives teetering just right on the edge? And then how often do you have the House teetering right on the edge and the Senate split 51-49? Wow, that's pretty rare. Now, think about the enormous gains in governorships, state legislative seats, state legislative chambers that Republicans had over the 8 years that President Obama was in office, netted over well over 900 state legislative seats from coast to coast over those 8 years. But think of it, 3/4 of all the governorships in the country are up this time. 4/5 of all the state legislative seats in the country are up this time in these midterm cycles. And when you think of the gains that Republicans had, so that now Republicans have more seats, more offices held than at any point since the 1920s. And so all of this is up in a really weird and challenging year. So, you know, this one is a pretty big one. And oh, by the way, I didn't even mention that this is the last midterm election cycle, 3/4 of governors, 4/5 of state legislative, before redistricting. So, you know, I'd say this one kind of is the biggest that, or one of the biggest we've ever seen, certainly midterms. The way I characterize this year, and look, Louisiana public school education, I try to simplify things, so I can, you know, that's the only way I can deal with things. But the way I look at things is we have what looks like a Democratic tidal wave up against a Republican seawall. And the question is, which is going to be stronger, the wave or the wall? And the answers are somewhat different in the U.S. House than in the U.S. Senate, which is different than in the governorships, which is different than in the state legislative seats. But I think that that's probably the right metaphor to look at it. Now, we know, and gosh, you guys, you know, if you're in New Hampshire, you have 50-yard line seats. But we know that midterm elections are referenda on incumbent presidents. And you know, I think everybody in this room knows that. But the statistics are fairly impressive when you think of the U.S. House. In the 38 midterm elections since the end of the Civil War, that would be the War of Northern Aggression, by the way. But anyway, I'm teasing. 35 out of 38, whichever party was in the White House, had a net loss of U.S. House seats. Now, you wouldn't think, okay, that's the House, but you wouldn't think that it would have that much of an impact on, say, governor's races. Since the beginning of the last century, so 1902, we've had 29 midterm elections. The party in the White House lost governorships net in 26 out of 29. Okay, what about state legislative seats? There shouldn't be any relationship at all. In 27 out of the 29 midterm elections since the beginning of the last century, party in the White House had a net loss of state legislative seats, averaging 375. Now, the laggard in the group is the U.S. Senate. Now, since we started the direct election of senators back in 1913 with the enactment of the 17th Amendment, the party in the White House has lost U.S. Senate seats in 19 out of 26. Now, that's only 73% compared to 92, 90, and 93% in those other three kinds of offices, because you have the midterm dynamic here, but you also, in the Senate, with only a third of the Senate up each time, it's which third is up, what happened 6 years ago, what happened 12 years ago. Very, very, very relevant. And then keep it in mind, the Senate, that for any given class of U.S. Senate seats, one time it's in a presidential year. 6 years earlier, it was in a midterm year. 6 years before that, it was in a presidential midterm, on like that. So it creates different rhythms and cycles than you see in the House and in the governorships and the state legislative. But now, why do we think that this happens? These filtering all the way down to the state legislative level. And political scientists have all kinds of theories, and I think you've got on the payroll a bunch of really good ones. They have all kinds of theories, but from my simple little mind, when I reduce it down, I think the biggest thing is turnout. That in midterm elections, we have about a third fewer people vote than in a presidential year. And to borrow a term that my mother used to use, not in a political context, but the people that I think disproportionately vote in midterm elections are people that have their noses out of joint. They're people that are mad about something, they're fearful about something, something's bugging them, and they are more motivated to vote in midterm elections than people in presidential years. Now, people in this room, I mean, you guys are you're all sick people. I mean, you know, this could have been in February of an odd-numbered year, and you'd still be, coming to things like this. But the thing is that to me, if the last election, if you're in a midterm year, and if in the last election 2 years earlier, if the election went the way you liked, and you're happy, you're complacent, or maybe you're disillusioned, doesn't matter. But no matter what, there's a fair chance you may not vote. But if you're madder than a wet hen, to use another phrase my mother used to use, you are motivated to vote. And I think that's the thing that drives these midterm outcomes more than anything else. Now, we all know and revere the memory of the late Tip O'Neill. Michael Harrington's back over here. Of the late Tip O'Neill, speaker back in the late 70s and 80s. And what's the most famous thing that O'Neill ever said? All politics is local. Now, to me, the meaning of that was you want to figure out what's going to happen in a state or a district. You look at the people that live there, you look at the demographics, you look at the voting history, then you take a look at the candidates and the campaigns and local issues and circumstances. And not always, but more often than not, you can kind of come up with a reasonably good idea of what's likely to happen. But even back when Tip O'Neill used to say that in the late 70s and 80s, it was a little bit of an exaggeration, because even back in the old days, about once a decade, we would have some weird election when all politics wasn't local, and where you would see a state or district that normally goes Democratic either goes Republican or almost goes Republican, or a place that normally goes Republican either goes Democratic or almost. You sometimes would see strong candidates lose to weak candidates, well-organized campaigns losing to poorly organized campaigns, well-funded campaigns losing to underfunded campaigns. You know, you see all these kinds of things happening in some of these weird years, but it was only once a decade, so what? Well, all of that changed in 1994 with President Bill Clinton's first-term midterm election. Now, everybody in this room would know that going into 1994, Democrats had a majority in the U.S. House for 40 consecutive years. 20 straight elections, Democrats won majorities. And over in the Senate, they'd had majorities in the Senate in 34 out of the 40 years. So, you know, the parties would kind of go up and down, oscillate a little bit up and down, but Democrats were almost always in charge. And so you didn't see, you know, huge waves going on back in those days. But 94, that all changed. And in that election, that we all remember, Democrats had a net loss of 8 seats in the U.S. Senate and 54 seats in the House of Representatives. Then fast forward to 2006. President George W. Bush's second-term midterm election. And we all remember the Gallup poll dropped down to 38% in the last poll before the midterm election. And Republicans lost their majorities in the House and the Senate, losing 6 Senate seats and 30 seats in the House. Fast forward to 2010, the first of the Obama midterm elections. Democrats lost 63 seats and control of the House. They didn't lose their majority in the Senate, but they did have a net loss of 6 U.S. Senate seats, which is, you know, that's a really big number. Then, 4 years later, 2014, Obama's second midterm election, Democrats then lost the Senate with a 9-seat loss and with 13 seats in the House of Representatives. So this is a long way of saying that now, in 4 out of the last 6 midterm elections, control of either the House or the Senate or both has switched. That's a long way from where things were in the 40 years leading into 1994. And I think what's happened is things have gotten a lot more parliamentary. These midterm elections have gotten much more explosive than they used to. And the old adage that people would say, well, I vote the person, not the party. Bull. I mean, now, that was true, but now people are pretty much, they're voting red, they're voting blue, or they're staying home. We're seeing less ticket splitting than we've ever seen before. So these midterms they're behaving much more explosively than they used to. So let's talk about, you know, we look at diagnostic indicators. We look for sort of canaries in the coal mine to signal, okay, is this going to be one of these wave midterm elections, or is this going to be the other kind? And one of the things we look at rearranging my talk here. One of the things we look at is, because it is a referendum on the incumbent president, is we look at presidential job approvals. Now, just looking at the last 8 midterm elections, so 1986 through 2014, in 4 of them, the incumbent president, last Gallup, and you have to use some yardstick, and Gallups, they poll more than anybody else, so just to use them as a yardstick. But in 4 of them, the incumbent president had a job approval rating over 50% in the last Gallup poll going into the midterm election. Actually, in each one of them, it was 55% or over. In those 4, the average of the last 8 elections was no net change whatsoever. In the Senate, it was a net loss of 2. So, yeah, not bad at all for these if it's over 50 or specifically over 55. But in the other 4 that are under 50, and specifically each of them were 46% or lower, the average was a 40-seat net loss in the House and a 7-seat loss in the U.S. Senate. That's a really, really big deal. And and you could, so where's the president's job approval rating really does matter. Now, a couple of, I was speaking to a group a few months ago, and I said, the funny thing about President Trump, and then I thought, well, wait a minute. Or I think I said the unusual thing, and I thought, well, this is a long damn list. So let me amend it. One unusual thing about President Trump is, the normal model is presidents, you get elected, you start off with a honeymoon, you start off with a reasonably big job approval number, and then over time, that job approval rating starts to go down. But there is an initial benefit of the doubt that presidents usually get. Now think about George W. Bush for a second. You don't really come up with, I'm going to say I'm looking at the wrong piece of the paper. I reordered my poll. Well, anyway, I've got this memorized. What the hell? The first Gallup poll, wait, first put it in context. So George W. Bush, he loses the popular vote nationally by 0.5 percentage point to Al Gore, basically 500,000 votes, wins the election based on Florida, contested outcome, goes all the way to Supreme Court. So you don't become president under circumstances a lot tougher than President George W. Bush had. You know what his first Gallup job approval rating was 1 week in? 57%. Where clearly there were a bunch of people that didn't vote for George W. Bush that were willing to give him the benefit of the benefit of the doubt. President Obama's first job approval rating was either 67 or 68. It's wherever that. Bill Clinton's was 58%. I mean, that's sort of what normally happens. But for President Trump, he received 46% of the popular vote. His first job approval rating, the Gallup poll, was 45, and he never saw 45 again. It was always down until in June. He came back up to 45 for a week or so, and then now, last week, it was at 40%. The average for his entire term is 39%. So the starting off big and then gradually declining, that model hadn't worked. And the fact is that President Trump's job approval ratings really don't move that much. And if you think about it, since just using the Gallup numbers for a moment, his average since taking office is 39%. Highest he's ever been was 45% in the weekly, and the lowest weekly he ever got was 35%. But overwhelmingly, he's within 3 points of 39%. And if President Trump were a stock, you would say he's got a really narrow trading range. And he could have devastating events happen. And, the Bob Woodward book, at least in Gallup, it dinged him a point. Shoot. Now, there are some, now, when you're looking, I'll get to the averages in a second. Good things. You know, hey, we get GDP over 4%, or briefly it looked like we had, looks like we're going to get a peace deal with North Korea. Those numbers didn't move much. Now, the thing is, each of the pollsters, their numbers are somewhat different, and they typically, and that's one reason why we like to look at averages, because there's a tendency that people have. You look to the poll that tells you what you'd like to see happen, and that's obviously the most accurate poll. And any poll that tells you what you'd rather not see is obviously a methodologically flawed poll. And so the way to guard against that kind of cherry picking, I think, is just look at the averages. So you could look at the Real Clear Politics average, which when I checked yesterday morning was at 41% approval. Nate Silver's 538 had it at 40. It fluctuates by a half a point or so from day to day. The most recent Fox News poll was at 45. CNN just came out with a 36, but that's kind of an out. The Fox runs a little warm. The CNN, that was kind of an outlier to the bottom end. The last NBC Wall Street Journal poll was at 44. But the thing is, there hasn't been that much of a fluctuation in his numbers. But one of the things that's been very durable through this whole time since President Trump took office is the intensity of opposition. And to be honest, I think intensity in a midterm election when a third fewer people vote than a presidential year, I think it's a pretty big deal. Because to be perfectly honest, and some of you will find this painful, but I think intensity was part of what happened back in 2016. That you had a lot of people that were really fairly ambivalent about Hillary Clinton. You had one group of people that really wanted to see Bernie, and another group of people would rather have seen Joe Biden run and win the nomination, and some people would like to have had anything else. And it's not to say that there weren't people that were really, really, really enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton, because there were. My wife and daughter are 2 out of the 3. But there were a lot of people that were planning to vote for her that weren't really excited about doing it. But they were prepared to hold their noses and vote because they weren't going to vote for Donald Trump. I would argue the seminal point, and I realize this is counterintuitive, and I'm saying something counterintuitive in front of a room full of political junkies and experts, but I would argue that the seminal moment was the release of the Billy Bush Access Hollywood tape. And you know why? Because suddenly the race was over. Hillary was going to win. There was no chance Donald Trump was going to win. The election's over. So that anyone who was ambivalent about Hillary Clinton, anybody that really didn't particularly want to vote for her, they had to pass. They didn't need to vote because the election was over. And so if you wanted to pick up a gallon of milk or your dry cleaning on the way home from work instead of voting, if you wanted to throw a vote for Jill Stein, by the way, was I the last person in the country to find out that in that famous picture in Moscow at the banquet with Vladimir Putin, where you had General Flynn, and you saw there that Jill Stein was there? Now, I'm sure it's because of Vladimir Putin's commitment to climate change and to green energy. I mean, I'm sure there is a really good reason why she was there. But the thing is, if you wanted to throw a vote to Jill Stein, you could. If you wanted to legalize weed and throw a vote to Gary Johnson, you could. You had to pass. It didn't matter. But on the other side, you had one group of people that really, really, really liked Donald Trump. You had a second group of people that just liked the idea of electing a business person to be a president. They liked the idea of voting for a business person. And some of them, thought, well, Obama had been anti-business. I want to vote for a business person. You have a third group of more conventionally wired Republicans that Donald Trump was not their cup of tea. But you know what? Supreme Court nominations, judicial nominations, I'm going to vote Republican. Probably not going to win, but I'm going to vote Republican no matter what. And then there was a fourth group of people that just hated Hillary Clinton. She called me deplorable. I think the word deplorable probably cost her 200,000 votes. And in an election where 137 million people nationwide vote, and the election comes down to 78,000 people in 3 states, you know, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania by 0.7 of a point each, Michigan, the close one, 0.2 of a point. You look at that and you say, you know, they're probably, anyway, and I'm going to get on to this more, but the intensity, I think, really matters. And what we're seeing consistently is between, for every, when you ask approve, disapprove, and then you ask, well, do you strongly or moderately approve, or do you strongly or moderate disapprove? When you look at the intensity, between 1.5 and 1.8 people strongly disapprove for every person that strongly approves. And in fact, we saw that 1.8 to 1 ratio in both the most recent Fox poll and the most recent CNN poll. So in other words, the one that was higher than just about all the others and the one that was the lowest of all the others both had a 1.8 to 1 strong disapprove to strong approve thing. So that intensity, that's a danger signal. And one of the other things we look at, and again, we're trying to use these diagnostic indicators to figure out what's going to happen in midterm election, is we look at other measures of intensity. And in the most recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll, the way they do it is they ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how interested are you in the upcoming election, with 10 being high and 1 being low. 65% of Democrats, Democratic voters, of registered voters who are Democrats, 65% said that they were 9s or 10s. Only 49% of Republicans said they were 9s or 10s. Fox News asks it differently. They ask, are you more or less enthusiastic than normal about the upcoming election? Among Democrats, 51% said they were more enthusiastic, only 43% of Republicans. 57% of liberals said they were more enthusiastic, only 43% of conservatives. Among people who said they voted for Hillary Clinton, 50% said they were more enthusiastic. Only 43% of Trump voters said they were more enthusiastic. So by lots and lots of measures, you could see these, remember the Lost in Space TV show, and remember the robot when something bad was about to happen? Danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger. Well, you know, all these are sort of flashy. And then the last thing we look at is the generic ballot test. Now, there are 2 ways of doing it. One way is just if the election held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate for Congress or the Republican candidate for Congress? The other way, the way NBC and Wall Street Journal poll is asked, is which party would you rather see in control? But it's 2 different ways of asking, but basically it's interchangeable. And as of yesterday, the average was Democrats ahead by 8 in the Real Clear Politics and 8.5 in Nate Silver's 538. And actually, after I looked this up, there have been a couple more polls that were in the 12-13 range or 11 to 13 point range. So those numbers are probably a little bit higher. Again, you know, just sort of danger, danger, and danger. In fact, the last Fox National poll had Democrats ahead by 11 points. And then the last thing we look at is election results since November of 2016 as sort of, you know, like large sample polls in specific places. Now, if I worked for the Democratic National Committee, I would be standing up here and I would proudly say, well, Republicans went 0 for 5 in statewide elections in the last year. And technically speaking, that's true. But I just heard that Doug Jones is going to speak to. Does anybody think that the Alabama U.S. Senate race last December was a referendum on Donald Trump, on President Trump? No. It was a referendum on Roy Moore. And this guy was radioactive before we even knew that he had an unhealthy interest in high school girls. And if I sound a little edgy on this subject, maybe it's because when I realized that when Roy Moore was in his 30s, he dated more high school girls than I did when I was in high school. But you know, maybe my feelings got hurt. But you know, Alabama, okay, that doesn't count. And then you think of New Jersey. Now, New Jersey's a Democratic state. Now, occasionally, they will elect Republicans governor just to kind of keep the legislature in check, kind of like what Massachusetts oftentimes does. But the thing about it is, but you know, it's a lot more of a Democratic state. Now, after the Bridgegate, after 8 years of Chris Christie, and here's a guy that has sharp elbows, and it's not that big of a state. And after the Bridgegate thing, there were probably social diseases with higher favorable ratings in New Jersey than Chris Christie had. So to be honest, I think the poor woman that was his lieutenant governor, I don't think she had that much of a chance, to be perfectly honest. So let's take those two off the list. But that still leaves the governor's race in Virginia, a purple state, the lieutenant governor's race, attorney general's race, and all those Democrats, they swept, but also they beat the point spread, and in that governor's race, very, very, very handily. So you look at that. You look at congressional special elections. Now, Republicans, they only had a net loss of 1 seat in the special elections since November 2016, the Pennsylvania 18 Connor Lamb win. But if you look across the 9 Republican seats that had specials, each one, the Democrat overperformed Hillary Clinton by at least 8 points. Now, you think, whoa, that's kind of, and some really, really close calls, like that Pat Tiberi seat in Ohio a month or so ago, where Republicans held on, but only by 1 point, and that was a district that Trump had won huge. And then the last time I checked in state legislative elections since November 2016, Democrats had picked up 44 Republican-held state legislative seats. Republicans had picked up 4 Democratic state legislative seats. So you just sort of look at all this, and it builds a pretty strong case that there's a wall out there. Now, let's look at, or there's a wave out there. So let's look at the wall. So let's talk about the House first. And everybody here knows that Democrats need 23 seats to get a majority, a 23-seat net gain to get a majority in the House. After the Pennsylvania remapping, there are now 25 Republican-held seats in districts that Hillary Clinton carried. It had been 23, but with Pennsylvania, it moved from 23 to 25 nationally. Open seats, Republicans have 38, Democrats only have 20. And some of that's driven by term limits, but some of it is, you know what, this is going to be an ugly year. I'm gonna bail out. But there is a wall there. And part of that wall, biggest piece of the wall, is where district lines are formed. Now, the thing is, we know that in all but 3 states, state legislatures draw the map. Some states, the governor's involved, some states not. But the thing is, if you're ever going to have, and I'm going to use a technical political science term here, a sucky election, the last sucky year that you want to have an election is, remember midterms, 3/4 of the governorships, 4/5 of the state legislature, is the last midterm before redistricting. Well, 2010 was a horrific year for Democrats, and so Republicans took majorities of the state Senate chambers, state House chambers, and suddenly in most states, Republicans were in a position to draw the maps and to do to Democrats what Democrats had done to Republicans for so many years. Now, not every state. I live in Maryland. It's a Democratic gerrymander. If you lived in Illinois, that's a Democratic gerrymander. But Republicans got some really, really friendly lines here. And that is a seawall that would help save a Republican majority in a pretty good size wave. But then there's one thing above that, and that's population sorting, or where people live. Keeping in mind that once you win a district by 1 vote, every vote you get above that point is wasted. Ask yourself this question: where do Democratic voters live? They live in urban areas. They live in cities and college towns. And where do Republican voters live? Well, everywhere else. That Republican voters are just more efficiently allocated around the country. Putting aside where district lines are drawn, our House editor, who you should get to come up and speak sometime, David Wasserman, brilliant guy. He's 30 years younger than I am and has twice the IQ points, actually probably 3 times. But anyway, Wasserman likes to say, if Democrats really want to win a majority in the U.S. House and hold it, what they should do is spend money on a massive voter relocation program and urge Democratic voters to kind of move away from the cities, move out of the college towns. But anyway, so between the wall and the population patterns, This is or between the district lines and population, this is a really good sized wall so that it takes a hell of a wave to get over that wall. Now, right now, we would put the odds at about 70% that the wave is going to be taller than the wall. This is a really big sized wave. Now, this magnitude of wave, and actually with the hurricane, I mean, I probably should find some other metaphor, but anyway, this kind of wave back in the old days would be 40, 50, 60 seats. Right now, what we're looking at is we think it's going to be between 20, most likely be between 20 and 40, with 23, obviously the tip, where it tips over into Democratic hands. But here's what makes me nervous, is if we're wrong, if it's not between 20 and 40, it's north of 40. It's not going to be under 20. And one of the things we've noticed, and Tom and a bunch of people in this room remember this, 1994. 1994, the Clinton midterm, Republicans needed a 40-seat net gain. If you went through from Alabama's 1st district all the way through Wyoming, and if you went through every race in the country, you might be able to come up with 31, 32, 33 seats that Republicans could plausibly pick up. You couldn't get to 40, which is what they needed. And what happened on election day? They won. Well, it's actually dependent upon how you count some party switch, but 52 or 54, depending upon which book you look at and how you count things. But 50 or 50, you had people that you had Republican challengers who won who didn't get a dime out of the National Republican Congressional Committee. That they knocked off Democratic incumbents. Fast forward to 2006, Rahm Emanuel, really smart guy. He was chair of the DCCC. First chairman of the DCCC we'd ever had that had used to be a staffer. He had been the field director back a few years earlier. Anyway, Democrats picked up 63 seats that year. There were Democrats that won in 2006 that knocked off Republicans who didn't get a dime from the DCCC. That these things, when you get a good-sized wave, it goes bigger. It kind of reminds me of the scene in Jurassic Park, the original one. And you remember they're driving along and they look in the rearview mirror and the dinosaurs running right behind them, and then the little thing says, "Objects may be closer than they appear." Well, the thing is, in these wave years, they have a tendency to go bigger than you think. So we're being conservative in saying 2040, but something, look, could things happen between now and November 6th? Of course something could happen, but something would have to happen to change the trajectory of this election. It looks like it's going, north of 23. So that's the House. Now, technically speaking, you would expect the Senate, it's only 51-49, you would think the U.S. Senate, the Republican majority in the Senate, would be in even more danger than in the House, but actually that's not the case. I mean, in the House, Republicans have 54% of the seats, and in the Senate, obviously, it's 51. But that's not the case, because again, remember, you look back 6 years, 12 years ago. 12 years ago, 2006, George W. Bush, second-term, midterm, Iraq, 38% approval rating, and Republicans lost. Democrats had a net gain of 6 U.S. Senate seats. Then, 6 years later, it's 2008. 2012. President Obama's winning by 3 percentage points, a little wider over Governor Romney than we expected. I think it's safe to say that Obama had the best organized presidential campaign in American history, and it was pretty damn close to a 50-state campaign. Pulled out Democratic votes. Democrats picked up 2 more Senate seats on top of the 6 that they won 6 years earlier. So that's why Democrats in this cycle have 26 seats up at risk and Republicans only have 9. Now, 26 to 9, that's a lot of exposure. That's a problem for Democrats. But it's actually worse than that, because Democrats have 10 incumbents up, 10 Democratic Senate seats up in states that Trump carried, 10. Republicans have exactly one seat up in a state that Hillary Clinton won, Dean Heller out in Nevada. Now that sounds really bad, doesn't it? But it's actually worse than that. Because of the 10 Democratic Senate seats up in Trump states, 5 of them are up in states that President Trump won by 19 points or more. Now, let's put this in a New Hampshire context. Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire by just under 0.4 of a percentage point. So think of 0.4 of a point, now think of 19 points. You know what, 40, I mean, the margin was like 40, I mean, wow, this is, so if you're Heidi Heitkamp, a Democrat up in North Dakota, a state that Mitt Romney won by 20 points, Trump by 36. If you're Joe Manchin in West Virginia, a state that Romney won by 27, Trump by 42. If you're Joe Donnelly in Indiana, a state that Romney won by 10, Trump by 19. Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Romney by 9, Trump by 19. John Tester in Montana, Romney by 14, Trump by 21. I'm not predicting that all 5 of them lose because I don't think all 5 of them are going to lose. I don't think John Tester is going to lose in Montana, for example. But you're talking about 5 Democrats that are up in really, really, really ugly places. And we haven't even talked about Florida, Bill Nelson, who's got Rick Scott, the governor, running against him. And I'm going to use another technical political science term here. Scott, besides being really, really smart and running great campaigns, you know, and having an incredible intensity, besides those 3 things, he has more money than God, you know, personal checks. So we haven't even included that. And then there are a handful of others we're kind of keeping an eye on. Now, conversely, you've got the Dean Heller, the 1 Republican seat up in a Clinton state. Then you've got the 2 opens in Arizona and Tennessee, where there are unusual circumstances in each one, where both races are effectively dead even right now. And then you've got the new competitive race, Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke down in Texas. Now, look, right now the average is Cruz ahead of O'Rourke by a little over 3 percentage points. Did I expect it to get to this? Hell no, of course I didn't. I mean, the thing is, a potted plant as a Republican would have a, I don't know, 8-9 point lead in Texas, you know, I mean, but, you know, somebody that's just got an enormous amount of warmth and cuddliness and charisma like Ted Cruz, you know, and Beto O'Rourke is this charismatic and getting more, you know, but it's at 3 points now, and I'm surprised it says, now, I think the last point or 2 are going to be really, 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 really hard, and I still expect Cruz to win, but boy, this thing's really close, and if we woke up the morning after the election and Cruz lost, I wouldn't be stunned. I mean, obviously the demographics of the state's changing. You have lots of people from outside of Texas that are moving in the suburbs there. It's changing, but it hadn't changed this much. But anyway, so you've got basically 4, 5, 6 Democratic Senate seats up that are in real danger, and you've got 4 Republican seats that are in real danger, and you've got the wave, and you've got the wall. This is the most lopsided U.S. Senate map that we've seen in our lifetimes. I mean, Democrats have never had a map that was tilted this far in their direction, and until this year, Republicans had never had one like this. So it's wave and wall. Or to use that wave metaphor, yeah, this is a big wave. This is a really big wave. But you know what? The Senate is at most of these Senate states are at a pretty high altitude. That wave is going to, or put it differently, there's only one competitive U.S. Senate race in the country that didn't go for Donald Trump. These are, you know, this is high ground, so the wave will mean less. Now, we think that there's about a 1 in 3 chance that the wave is big enough and that Democrats get a majority. Now, to be honest, I think the most likely outcome is break even, no net change, or +1 for either side. That it's most likely going to be in that zone. And that we could see $750 million spent on the U.S. Senate races with no net change. Now, a couple of things make me nervous about this. And I'm looking for a piece of paper and not finding it, but I've got it memorized. Pew Research Center did a study recently where they looked at all Senate elections starting in 2013. And what they found, there have been 73 U.S. Senate races. 69 out of 73, the party that won that Senate race was the one that won that state in the most recent presidential election. 69 out of 73. That's how potent geography is. But here is another number, and that is, when we look back at the last 10 elections, and when we look at, we do the ratings, solid, Democrat, Republican, likely Democrat, Republican, lean Democrat, Republican, toss-up. And before Election Day, we really try to kind of pare down the toss-ups. But when you look at the races that the Cook Political Report had rated as toss-up going into Election Day, that in the last 10 elections, between 69 and 89% of them in each of those broke one way. In other words, they either on average, 80% would go Democratic in that year, or 80% would go Republican on average. In other words, that they're teetering right on the edge, and whatever the last kind of gust of wind, they tend to topple one direction. Now, you'd think that it might be, they might go with whichever way the wave's going. That's logical. But some of you remember 1982, for example. It was the last election before I started my newsletter. Remember, Republicans had just picked up a majority in the U.S. Senate in 1980 in the Reagan landslide, and they had a very precarious margin in the U.S. Senate. But Republicans held on to their majority in 1982, a period where unemployment had just hit 10%. We were in a recession, but they held on. They held on by winning they won 4 Senate races by a grand total of 39,000 votes. They won 5 Senate seats by 62,000 or less. And some of this was winning a bunch of small states by very narrow margins. So you've got some relatively small states up this time, states like Nevada, North Dakota, West Virginia. You've got some big states like Florida. So the thing about it is, I am reasonably sure we're going to see a Democrats win a majority in the House. I can't tell you which party is going to gain seats in the U.S. Senate. And I know right now everybody's all hot to trot, the wave is now so big that's going to lop the Senate over. You know what? Texas is the only basically really close Senate race that is any different from where it was 2 months ago. That's it. The ones that are really close now were really close. Not that much have changed. You know what I think has happened is people have gotten, the conventional wisdom is Democrats are going to win the House back, and they're now accepting that, and they're bored with that. So now they're talking about the Senate. Well, actually, other than Texas, the Senate isn't any better or worse for Republicans than it was 2 months ago. But it's just people are now more agitated about the Senate. So Democrats may get to pick up 2 seats. Hell, they could lose 2 seats. Now, keep in mind, and I know I need to go to Q&A because I've run out of time, but keep in mind the next 2 cycles, 2020, 22, there are a lot more Republican seats up. That map is the other way around. There are more Republican seats up in those 2 elections. But I think we're going to see, anyway, in 2 minutes, because I suspect we'll have some questions to talk about presidential a second, but I don't have the faintest idea what people are going to do in 2000. And the question I would just ask for Democrats is, what is going to be the dominant theme? Is it going to be ideology? Is it going to be identity politics? Is it going to be electability? And, ideology, if you were going to ask me where is the center of gravity in the Democratic Party right now, is it left of center, sort of where Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, sort of that part of the party? Or is it way over to the left where Bernie and Elizabeth are? This moment, I'd say the center of gravity in the Democratic Party is on that side, the left side, and moving further over. Now, do I think that's the optimal place for Democrats to be? Probably not, but I think that is what's happening. Or is it identity politics? And we're going to have, the African-American vote is incredibly important in Democratic primaries. And, could we get a Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Deval Patrick? Hispanic vote's awfully important. Could we get Eric Garcetti? Women, obviously Warren. I mentioned Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar. On paper, if you were going to go to central casting and say, give me a Democratic nominee, you know what I would do? And I mean, Democrats will never do this, but you know what I'd do? I would pick someone with a lot of really good governmental experience who has never worked a day of their lives in Washington, D.C., and certainly has never been in Congress. And I would get somebody that's left of center, but not necessarily from a discernible place on the ideological spectrum, kind of vaguey a little bit. Now, that's not what Democrats are going to do. But anyway, but we've got current and former governors, mayors like Hickenlooper, McAuliffe, Steve Bullock, Jay Inslee, Martin O'Malley, Deval Patrick, Garcetti, Mitch Landrieu from my home state, and then we've got Michael Bloomberg, who's taken a look at it as a Democrat. So, wow, I have no idea what they're gonna do. But the last thing I'll say is what we don't know is what's the risk tolerance for Democrats going into 2020. How much do they want to risk? For a lot of Democrats, it's going to be, who is I want to go with a liberal. I want to go with someone that is the opposite of President Trump. I want to go with somebody liberal, which is, that's fine. But how far do you want to go before you risk re-electing Donald Trump? So it's kind of like when you go to an investment advisor, one of the first things they want to do is they want to figure out what your risk tolerance is. Well, Democrats have to figure out what their risk tolerance is in terms of next time and what to look for. And wow, I'm out of time.